My brothers and my sisters are stranded on this road, a hot and dusty
You're
road.
paying the bank. If the bank owns the house for the first 10 years, you're paying them rent for the first 10 years. So I think the elephant in the room seems to be that these financial institutions who ran the racket for the entire course of this century so far that we're living in, and longer really, are too big to fail, are considered too big to fail by the Attorney General's office at the United States level, will not be prosecuted, will not be jailed, will not be called to account for their bankruptcy, and are running hot flows of money, whether it be drug money from the African opium trade, or the Russian mafia, or Chinese billionaires, hot money into real estate markets like San Francisco, and they're jacking up rates. Now, it seems like that's the question that has to be asked, because if we're putting money into job creation and not property prices, then a lot of those problems will be solved.
Thank you. Who has heard of quantitative easing? Does anybody know what quantitative easing means? The Federal Reserve System has been pumping between 40 and 80 billion dollars a month into the equities markets to keep banks from failing. Where do you think 40 to 80 billion dollars a month goes? That's why you get no interest in your savings account. Okay? Half the sales, I am told by a number of realtors in this town, are all cash. All cash sales in San Francisco, with no waiving inspections. Nobody is, half the folks who are buying the units that the Housing Action Committee is testifying to be built to lower housing costs by an odd notion of supply and demand, kind of a charming notion of supply and demand, is bought up by speculators with hot money coming out of Wall Street. And it's not just in the United States. I'll read you from Sunday's New York Times. Luxury towers are sprouting up, adding density to unlikely places from Brooklyn waterfront to San Francisco's mid-market district. But adding inventory to high-end does nothing to help the middle. One of the many irritating peculiarities of the 21st century boomtown housing market. Building new apartments can actually push rents higher, and amenities for the masses, like transportation and parks, may have the effect of pricing them out. Everyone wants to live in these places, so no one can afford to. What's a global city to do? The first thing that we have to do is get control of our banking system, folks. It's out of control, and that is the principal federal housing policy, is speculation.
Is this a housing policy? Is this a housing policy for this year?
I would hope so. It's got to start at some time, Tim. We're not going to build our way out.
But they're coming,
when
folks.
Half of what we build goes to speculators.
They're coming.
Who's coming?
Who's coming?
People live in San Francisco.
People wanted to live in San Francisco in 2000. And they came, and in 2 years, 50,000 of them left.
We're left to betting against, hoping that high-tech crashes. That's what we're.
Okay,
that's what we have to
I want to get back to questions. Back there, and there.
Hey, Tim, let's rest a little bit. You know, when you describe how we should be doing steel and glass towers, and we should be building, like, stakes over a podium, and that'd be our way out of this, it's just kind of funny because, at the same time, when you say that we have these anti-housing policies, I'm trying to remember to flash back over the last 10 years of us tangling in front of the Boston Planning Commission, where the neighborhoods lose all the time, and you're advocating for steel and glass towers.
No. I didn't say that. I said those are being built, and the people that occupy them don't seem to need our help or anybody's help in this room.
Okay, but where I'm going with this is, what kind of policy specifically are you saying we need to do to change the supposed anti-housing policy that I just don't even see when I'm at the planning commission with that? I mean, are you saying we should actually upzone more over on this side of town, which has already been upzoned to double our population? Are you saying we should force building West Portal or Geary.
No, not West Portal.
You know, but, right? Are you saying
West Portal.
they're already zoned higher than they are. So do you want a fourth building over there? Or are you saying that on Van Ness and Geary, you want to go in and fight those guys over there?
Okay, let's let him answer the question.
Yeah.
Anybody from West Portal here? Yes, I do want higher, it's zoned for 26 feet. If you promise not to tell, I'll say, yes, I'd love to see more height and density on the west side of town. Is that increment that could be raised, is that enough to help us? It's an interesting question. I think it deserves trying. I think we ought to put policies in place that will promote that kind of housing, see if it works. If it works, put it on steroids and grow it. If it doesn't, can it? But I'm curious about this, you know, Tony, I love Tony, he's a scallywag. The housing, you know, I want to go to that Prop B, the waterfront, you know, which is directly threatening 3,000 units of housing planned currently on what is now derelict maritime industrial land, of which the 3,500 would be permanently affordable. I think you guys, you know, probably you guys have supported that already. What's curious to me, and I have to ask you, is nowhere in Prop B does it say where that housing should be put instead. Tony, would you agree to upzone Potrero Hill a little bit to take a few hundred units that might be your share of that housing that apparently shouldn't be built there? Where should it go instead?
We already rezoned all Potrero Hill to revolving down.
Potrero Hill didn't get rezoned. Potrero Hill didn't get rezoned.
Sorry, but you can blame me for anything.
16th Street.
I want to just, so if Prop B passes, I'm assuming, and I've talked to a few people about this, that the projects you're talking about, which are the giant site, Pier 70, are going to go ahead and build. They're just going to build in a slightly different configuration, and they'll build fewer of those super expensive towers and more of those 5 floors of wood frame over podium, which means the housing they build will probably be cheaper. So I'm not sure
That's
what
exactly
you're
what
saying.
Pier 70 is doing. That's exactly what Pier 70 is doing.
I just think,
All they're going to do is they're not going to
build.
build the 250 and 350 foot towers, but they're just going to build the housing that was going to be built there anyway.
I think the unit count goes way down, the value goes way down, and as a result, public benefits go down. There's less to take out of it.
I've looked at 2 of those sites, and the unit count doesn't have to go down.
The port itself, don't take my word for it. The Port of San Francisco did an economic analysis saying that they're not allowed to take a position for or against Prop B, but they said that Prop B threatens their property, that is to say, our property, it's public property, with 8.4 billion with a B in downzoning. Why would we downzone our own properties? Why would anyone do that? But that's, you know.
Well, so just to follow up the fence then, for a moment, just don't be shy. You're saying that we should be building 40 stories over the giant parking.
Okay, we have a few more people that have their hands up, so I'd like to move on. Over here, and
Oh,
then,
let's take him answer that.
I think he's answered. Yeah.
So this question is about.
Oh wait, did you already ask a question?
Yes.
Okay, we gotta go to people that haven't. Over here, and then over there, and then back. No, you were next. So you, and you.
Well,
Go
really
ahead.
quickly, 2 things. One is I didn't hear anything about, I know about inclusionary housing and that in fact there is a law that they have to build it. But my question is there a way to enforce them building that affordable housing first, or at least it coming on the market at the same time as the market rate? And I was just also going to say I live in a co-op in the Western Addition that was funded by the pension fund of the ILWU. I'm just wondering, is there any way to have like cooperative housing with the pension fund of the city? Because the city's pension fund has to be huge.
The way in which the inclusionary ordinance works in San Francisco is that you have to have the affordable housing come online at the same time or make the payment. If you make the payment, of course, you won't get the housing at the same time. Yes, co-ops, there is a very avid group of cooperators in San Francisco. 3 buildings now have been...
What is it, 200 units in total?
Yeah. The difficulty is, given today's real estate prices, is buying. I mean, we don't have a red army. We can't seize property. We have to buy it. And that's where we get into the whole yawning maw of where do we get the money to buy it. But yes, it works if you buy it.
Anybody else? Okay, the gentleman back there in the Yeah, right there.
This will take 30 seconds to ask a question. Many of you have a piece of paper which I handed out at the very beginning, and it suggests or it states that real estate is made of two values, building values and land values. Land itself inherently has no value except in the context of the community. I would argue that land values belong to the community. And without our addressing that point, we're not going to address the housing crisis in any significant way. In fact, all the solutions which I've heard are talking around about how do we raise revenue for.
Do you have a question?
Question is, do you support the full taxation of land values? And I'm asking the audience as well as the panel. What's your position on revising Prop 13 so we tax land values heavily and perhaps don't need to tax housing itself at all?
Yes, on changing Prop 13, good point.
Yes.
Yes.
I think many people support that. I'm not sure it's going to happen soon.
Like me.
This gentleman here, and then there was somebody else back here. Yeah. So you and then person in the back and then you.
Calvin had an interesting notion earlier on when he said something about South Market and that he would propose to not have any building built. This would be the way of solving the problem if it wasn't the building of the kind that you want. Is that accurate?
Uh-huh.
Not quite.
Not quite, that it's metered.
Can I take a shot at this? Yeah. Because I think I understand it, I can explain it quickly. The idea is that the agency I work for, ABAG, says that San Francisco's housing need is about 1/3 market rate, 2/3 below market rate. So what Supervisor Kim has said is there'll be a floor, not 60%, but 30%. And that when the city can't reach 30% of its need, or the 30% it's supposed to build for affordable, then a market rate project won't be stopped, but it will need a conditional use permit, which makes it harder to do.
Which
Doesn't
can
make it
stop it
possible.
easily.
And I think,
CU has ever stopped the housing development.
but I think what the purpose of this is, I would say, is to focus the attention of everyone on the need to create more affordable housing.
And preserve current affordable housing.
And preserve current
If
affordable housing.
numbers, then it also.
And so I think what will
takes the
happen
balance.
if it passes is there'll be a meeting in the mayor's office and people, including a lot of these developers, will say, what do we need to do to come up with not one, but probably 5 or 6 new sources of funding to build enough affordable housing that we come below that threshold so we don't have to do conditional uses. It actually would be, I think, a very helpful thing to focus the city's attention on the need to create more resources for affordable housing. I'll let any of
I
you.
think I like Calvin's idea of seizing the banks better.
Would you like a red army?
Yes.
Okay, there's a woman in the back there and then a woman right here. Okay, go ahead. You go first, then she'll go.
Oh, thank you. My statement, first of all, is the waterfront belongs to all of us. It's not for housing, it's for pleasure, open space, and the uniqueness of San Francisco. There are lots of other places to build, but the waterfront is special, and we want to keep it that way. We don't want to have a wall down there where only the privileged few will have the benefit.
Okay, thank you. Do you have a question for any of the panelists?
Yes. My question is, how about mixed income housing? In other words, not having these stipulations that we have a certain percentage of affordable housing elsewhere, but have mixed income, having high-scale, high-end renters or owners in condos, and middle income, have them all together. In the long run, we would avoid these ghettos that appear in years following. Those are my two issues. Also, one more thing, could we possibly have legislation to prevent speculation from abroad, China, Russia, wherever they put their money, because it's a sustainable place?
Well, let me take that question first because there's been talk in the city for decades about what's called an anti-speculation tax. And the way that works, if I understand it, is If you buy a piece of property and flip it in 1 year, you pay half your profit as a tax. It can be any amount, but let's say half. But then if you hold it 2 years, you might pay a third. 3 years, 10%, and if you hold it 4 years, you pay nothing. So it discourages very quick flipping of property for speculation. There is talk again, I think, of...
It's expected to be on the ballot, actually.
And I think that would discourage, whether you're from Russia or from Richmond or from Palo Alto, it would discourage speculation for anybody if something like that were to become a law.
But about the mixed income housing, sure, I think we all want to see vibrant, diverse neighborhoods with, a whole range of types of people. That's what community should be, right? And unfortunately, we do have a situation where we have intense concentrations of poverty in this city, where, there's the Potrero projects in your neighborhood, for instance, where we are seeing entrenched, long-term areas that are all poor people, and we're certainly seeing the opposite, which is certain segments of the city that are only for the rich, right? And someone not of that income wouldn't even, dare to set foot there, and would certainly not feel comfortable if they did. At any rate, so I think there's nothing wrong with that. I think that the more we can certainly have, the more wealthy brush up against people who are struggling, the more they might be sympathetic to their plight, et cetera, et cetera. The question is just, I think, how to achieve that. And I don't have an easy answer. I think inclusionary zoning is a really good example of at least trying to encourage that and incentivize that and require that on a certain level. But we have that in lieu fee problem. As there's been rebuilds of some of the public housing that's been experimented with more and more. Not so much market rate, but putting more tax credit or BMR units in the middle. So there are ways that we're seing that. I don't know if other people have ideas about how to get there, but I definitely think the idea of it makes a lot of sense.
There's no disagreement that we need more resources. I'm totally with Calvin on this. We have grossly inadequate resources to do this. We're not paying for it ourselves. It has to come from somewhere if we're going to do this. The program we have, I'll say, I'm like a broken record, the program we have is not going to scale sufficiently to solve the problem that we're facing. It's a very, very small, expensive solution. We've got to try and innovate different ways to do it. I just, I don't have anything brighter to say about it. But
one other quick thing about this, just about mixed income housing and how to achieve it, though, is that the Section 8 voucher program, which is now called the Housing Choice Voucher Program, federally funded, subsidized subsidy program, was a really an example of how that was, attempted to be achieved. And the idea is that people could go with their vouchers and live in any neighborhood in the city. And that's why it was called the Housing Choice Voucher Program. That's been the new name for it for quite a while. And so I think something like that, if there were resources, again, being provided to a program like that, it would be a really good way of actually achieving this type of mixed income communities. Because, how else, to say that a place like Pacific Heights, where there are a lot of wealthier people, would just, gladly embrace people from the Potrero projects, living next door to them. I think, unfortunately, we would have to, encourage, require, or whatever, to really create mixed income communities in a real fashion. So that's something to think about as just sort of a model or example. Again, totally under-resourced. Federal funding cutbacks have been, successive year after year, and so it's not currently the successful program that it should be. But
it's very difficult to do building by building through to make sure that every new building that's built is economically balanced. It's exceedingly difficult to do that. That's why many in San Francisco revere their neighborhoods. I mean, we have in many. It's easier to do at a community level than at a building level. To produce viable neighborhoods that have room for low-income people, middle-income people, and wealthy people. And that's what makes San Francisco so attractive, I think, to an awful lot of people who grew up in the suburbs and are used to kind of a mono economy and a mono culture. That's why they find San Francisco so exciting. It turns out to be increasingly difficult to maintain even a community level of economic integration, given the steroid economy that we're facing, especially the globalization of I hate to sound this way, but it is true, the globalization of capital. And the flow of capital moves much more rapidly than the flow of people. And oftentimes the flow of capital moves people out, especially lower income people. So the struggle that we're doing in San Francisco now is precisely that, is trying to preserve a city, a series of neighborhoods that have places for poor people, middle income people, and wealthy people to live. Very hard to do in a single building. Very difficult to do.
I guess this is where we disagree in some of it, is that in
This is
putting
where-
it out at a large, a high level view, is that does the question of neighborhood character trump the openness of San Francisco to people that are not wealthy? Which is a higher civic value? And I think it's very hard when people say, gee, no, I don't want that project here. I want it over there. That shouldn't be built here. It's I hate to say it, it's a strong civic value here. So before I finish, Tony asked about some suggestions. I'd like to see a housing bond that helps renters. What we've seen is there's been an immense flow of wealth from renters to property owners. And at some point you have to call into question whether it's equitable or not. And I think that a bond financed by taxes would be a way to maybe send some of that back and target it intelligently to the middle income, which is by far the worst served sector of housing, people that need housing. That's one. We're saying start to reform inclusionary. Look at the off-site rules that are designed to prevent anything being built off-site, which would be 20% instead of 12. Take the cap off micro units. There's a cap that makes no sense on it. Arbitrary. Let's put a cap on it. Micro units are the small, they're somewhere, imagine 300-foot apartments. They're very popular with young people. There's an insatiable demand for them. They can be built in cheap.
Cap then?
Sorry. One project filled half the cap. We're there.
And why is there a cap?
Well, because they're very dangerous, and we don't want any unintended consequences of building small, cheap housing.
I could answer that, but
Go ahead.
It was a negotiated compromise. The law was proposed, and many of us wanted to make sure that we didn't end up looking like Singapore, where they actually had to go back and restrict the proliferation of these types of tiny apartments that had pretty much destroyed their city. And so we wanted to do this in a cautious way where there was research involved and we saw what the true impact of it was.
The fear
So
was,
at this point, as Tim said, we're only halfway to the cap. It's not like it's been like super restricting this, creature that just,
And they turn out not to be that cheap.
And that's the other thing.
They're cheaper.
They're cheaper, but they're not affordable. Those are different things.
This is where we disagree.
Anyway,
It's a way to restrict housing production.
well, I'd like to chime in here just for 1 second. The fear was, to answer your question, that there was no way to control how they were used once they were built. Would they be used to house people? Would they be turned into hotels through Airbnb? Or would the Academy of Art University turn them into dorms? Now, being dorms, if they do new construction, as dorms is fine, but let's call them that. So the idea was, let's try 300, see what happens, and then see how things progress. If we can control Airbnb and we can control the Academy of Art University, maybe people will be open to more than just 300. But that was the idea behind this compromise.
And the other thing was the impact on infrastructure and neighborhoods in terms of the increase in density and transit, all that kinds of stuff. And would they basically be crash pads for folks working in Silicon Valley who could afford huge bucks, and therefore this impact I mentioned before around the ripple effect on adjacent rents and the longtime renters who've been living there. So there are a whole number of concerns, and so we wanted to do it in a reasoned, moderate, manner if we're going to introduce this actually very drastic change in our code.
Well, from a realtor point of view, someone explained to me, would you rather have these sort of very nefarious, questionable people from Silicon Valley, would you rather have them in their own units or trolling Bernal Heights and the Mission looking for charming Edwardians that have lots of upside remodel potential? Because it's sort of the choices. And what we've done is restrict a perfectly valid type of housing because, the politics.
But we haven't restricted
The other
it.
one would be student housing. We got to get serious about building student housing. There's a 60,000 bed shortfall right now, and a lot of the schools, and not just the Academy of Art University, who's an egregious bad actor, but a lot of the schools are skating on their responsibility. They attract thousands of students here and put them out on Craigslist and say, go find your own housing. And so what you get are apartments, 4 bedrooms, where students will get together and together can build or bid more and pay more than families can do. It's time that the schools got held to account a bit for satisfying some of the demand they're creating. Their density bonus. San Francisco, there's a discussion coming, heads up. San Francisco is out of compliance with a very important state, it's called the California State Density Bonus Law, that if you give certain concessions like inclusionary housing, you get a bonus. And the neighbors, the neighborhoods are going to be quite interested in it, but San Francisco has not been interpreting it legally. It's been restricting it. Height and density is a way.
That's one legal opinion. There are other legal opinions.
Watch what's
Fine,
coming.
we'll be happy to watch. Yes, it's not quite the Supreme Court thing.
Yet height and density. It's a Court of Appeals decision that said, here's the rules, and San Francisco is out of compliance.
Well, San Francisco does not count height as density. And there's it's an interesting legal question, but it's not quite, as Tim says, such a settled matter of law.
Okay, we are in the part of the program where we're supposed to be doing our closing statements, so I'm going to now I'm going to give a few more minutes.
Oh yeah,
I'm sorry, we missed you. Go ahead, yes. We recognized you already.
But getting there and getting to our jobs is the bit, right, due to traffic that we have to deal with. So I'm wondering, how does transportation and building bridges to get people back and forth across the bay factor into the discussion of us not having enough supply on this side?
Good question.
Invite us back to talk about regional planning and the San Francisco jobs, housing, balance, and the region's plan for balancing transit and housing. Today, the MTA made it clear that it wants to go forward with, $1.5 billion in new expenditures for public transit. There's a great debate for many of us. If you like if you like gentrification of housing, wait till you see gentrification of transit. Because there's a very real question around equity, as I think folks will know. Wait till the Warriors build on the T3rd line and see how many T3rds go all the way to Baby Hunter's Point instead of turning around and going back downtown after they drop folks at the Warriors. You have put your finger on a huge question, which is the infrastructure, the transit infrastructure, which is decidedly linked with employment. And I want to agree with Tim, you can't talk about housing in a meaningful way without talking about income. Housing is a function of income, and we need to talk about who works in San Francisco, how people earn a living in San Francisco, and where they have to travel. If you really think it's a fair way to pay for new service to mid-market and million-dollar condos with public transit by imposing a bond that is passed through to tenants, is deductible by property owners, but not by tenants, and a vehicle license fee, which is on people who drive cars to work, then you'll love the proposal being proposed by the Lee administration. If you think there ought to be another way of funding transit, like maybe the Warriors should pay, like maybe the Giants should pay, like maybe market rate housing developers should actually pay a transit fee, then you start seeing the nature of the debate over transit. But you're absolutely correct. It's a critical problem. It is not separate from housing. It is not separate from employment.
Okay, Sarah, your 2-minute closing statement.
2 minutes, okay. I just again want to hammer back on the importance of preserving our existing affordable housing rental stock that comes in our rent-controlled housing, that as much as Tim wants to minimize the impact of the Ellis Act evictions, first of all, I told you about the rates in which they're increasing. Now that's significant. If we don't start curbing them, we will continue over the years to have a loss, a permanent loss from our market of thousands and thousands of units. Especially in light of his supply and demand model, promotion, I'm surprised that he doesn't think that would have a dent. But the other thing about Ellis Act evictions is that, can't respond. Is that there are many more people that are forced out that are reported, because there's threats of Ellis Act evictions used all the time, where people then, out of fear, leave their units, and there are also buyout negotiations. So we really think the actual figure is 3 times what's reported at the rent board. And then the other thing is, it's not just the Ellis Act, Tim. It's also, and I know you know this, but it's also, when I talk about preservation of our rent-controlled housing, it's also what we talked about with Academy of Art, Airbnb, other corporate rentals. We have to tackle that, and part of what that takes is enforcement. Unfortunately, there has been no will, and certainly no action amongst our city leaders to actually enforce the existing laws we have that prevent that type of removal of permanent rent-controlled housing from our stock. So that's just a shame. And then other types of evictions, as I said, well, we don't lose the units off of rent control forever. What we do see is that the rents are then put back are then at market, set at market rate, which is so extremely high right now. So it is a real problem to lose even the residents in long-time rent-controlled apartments. And so eviction defense and things like that are utterly important to make sure that tenants stay in their homes who are long-time renters, and we don't see a differential of what was once affordable housing moving into then an extremely high-end rental unit. Thanks.
Colen,
I've taken my time.
I guess the thing that I find
so curious,
I'll give you 30 seconds to say something new.
28 seconds.
Say something
The
new.
thing that's so curious and interesting to me about this is how this point of view would make any difference whatsoever to San Francisco's overall affordability. If Sara succeeds at every level in everything she asks for, that she's mentioned today, is San Francisco going to become more affordable tomorrow? I just don't see how it happens, and there's no plan B behind it.
It will remain about at least somewhat as affordable as it is now for some of the people.
Intervene
That
here.
makes
I'm
a
gonna
difference.
I provided you some fairly depressing information tonight, so I want to leave you with a little bit of hope.
I could use it.
Despite our governor being one of the most anti-housing governors we've had in a long time, the state this year came close to passing one new source of funding for affordable housing, and it was Senator DeSaulnier's Senate Bill 391, which would have assessed $75 for every recording fee in the state, and would have generated around $500 million a year, every year, for affordable housing. It actually made it through the Senate, failed to get out of the House. There was pressure to get it out of the House, but then we lost the supermajority in the Senate because of 3 senators misbehaving. But there is now discussion.
Allegedly.
Yeah, I think it's off for the show. But the newer thing is Senator Steinberg in his cap and trade legislation is setting aside 20% of the cap and trade money for affordable housing. And if that gets up to what he believes will be $5 billion a year eventually and fairly soon, that would mean $1 billion a year for affordable housing. We're gonna have to see how that plays out with the negotiations between the legislature and the governor, but at least it's on the table. And the last thing I'll say is locally, there's something you're gonna be hearing about probably more and more, and it's the idea of doing something called acquisition rehab. What happens now is when a developer in South of Market or Rincon Hill has 50 units of affordable housing, people in the South of Market who are at greatest risk put their applications in, and one of the last ones they got 150, which is 5 times what they normally get. But they were competing against 2,000 other people. So of those 50 affordable units, 2 people in the Western Soma and other neighborhoods around there that are at great risk got units. If you spend the same money you spent on those 50 units to buy 50 units, to buy 8, 10, 12 unit buildings in those neighborhoods where you already have very low income and working families living, you can preserve those permanently as affordable. It's a more efficient way to spend the money, it turns out. And it's also 100% of the money you spend stops displacement, instead of maybe 5% of the money you spend on the project I just mentioned on Rincon Hill. So there is a small sites fund the city has now, and there's talk about leveraging that with additional money. And the other thing about it is, you won't know when a building becomes affordable because somebody will buy it. It'll be the same neighbors that have been there for the last 5, 10, 15 years. They just won't be forced to leave. They'll leave when they choose to leave. So I think that's a very promising program we're talking about in the state. I think I would like to thank our speakers. I would like to thank our hosts. I would like to thank all of you for staying here.